Hello there and welcome to this Medic Mind tutorial where today we're going to be looking at the UCAT and in particular an introduction to abstract reasoning or AR. My name's George and let's begin. There are several learning objectives of today. The first and most important is just to introduce you to this section. We're going to be doing that through a warm-up quiz, so testing your initial knowledge on spotting patterns. We're also going to be looking at why it's even tested in the first place, the challenges of AR experienced by our students, as well as some quick do's and don'ts towards the end. So what does the AR involve? Well, the first thing to say is all about spotting patterns, and you've guessed it, this can be quite abstract. And it's abstract in the sense that you're counting the number of sides of shapes, you're counting the number of shapes there are, whether they're black, white or grey, etc. The second part of the test is all about avoiding distractions. So the examiners have put in there sort of fake patterns or patterns that sort of don't fully add up in order to take you off course. The best candidates will rule those out quickly and focus on the pattern that's being tested. So let's look at the breakdown of abstract reasoning. The first thing to say is it's very fast-paced. You've got 13 minutes to do 55 questions. Now that's a very short amount of time to do each question, but remember that questions are organised into 11 sets of 5. That means that as soon as you've spotted the pattern, you've got 5 questions on that same pattern. So it's actually not as bad as it first seems. That means that you've got roughly 71 seconds per set, and by far the largest amount of time is spent spotting that pattern at the start. Once you've seen that pattern, it's very quick to do the remaining 4-5 questions. Okay, let's go through a warm-up quiz together then. So just to introduce you to this style of question, you can see we've got two things, set A and set B, as well as a bottom sort of item, which is all of the test shapes which we're going to be quizzed on. Your goal is to find out what links all of the examples in set A and what links all of the set examples in set B. What I mean by an example is each sort of box. You can see that there's 6 boxes in set A and 6 boxes in set B, each with a number of different shapes and examples inside. That's what I mean by an example. So we're essentially looking for a rule which links all of the examples in set A, and then a separate rule which links all of the examples in set B. Pause the video now and see whether you can have a go. Okay then, let's go through it together. So this is a very basic question. The ones in the UCAT are much harder, but this is just to introduce you to the AR section. So you can see in set A, we've got 6 boxes, 6 examples, each with a number of shapes inside. Now, it's not hard to see that each example has only black shapes in set A. So that's the pattern. That's what defines set A. They're only black shapes. Now, if we look at set B, what defines set B? What defines each example in set B? Well, it's only white shapes in each example. And that's what you'll often find. The patterns tend to be complementary. If set A has black shapes, then set B will tend to have the opposite, or white shapes. This is because they have to be mutually exclusive. Okay, so if we go through the test shapes that we're given, we can see that number 1 belongs in neither set. It has a mixture of black and white shapes. That's the same with example number 2. It has a mixture of black and white shapes, therefore it can't possibly belong to either because the rule in each case is that they're exclusively either black shapes or exclusively white shapes. Number 3 belongs in set A because it's black shapes. Number 4 belongs in set B, white shapes. And number 5 belongs in set A again because it's a single black shape. Hopefully you can see how that works, and that's introduced you to the mechanics of this kind of question. Now let's look through another example. This one's slightly more complicated, but again much easier than you would get in the exam, just to build up your knowledge of how these things work. So again, we're looking for a pattern which links all of the examples in set A and a pattern which links all of the examples in set B. Pause the video now and have a go for yourself. Okay, let's go through it together then. So you can see that whereas before it was exclusively black shapes and exclusively white shapes, in both set A and set B, you've got a mixture sometimes of black and white shapes. That's not quite the rule though, because you've still got examples in set B, for example, of white shapes just on their own. We therefore need to look for a more pattern, a different pattern. So if we look back at set A and try and compare examples in set A, you can see that all of them contain a black circle. That's really useful to know. We've spotted the pattern in set A. Now to try and work out the pattern in set B, it's useful to try and think of flips or inverses on the pattern that you've already spotted. If set A has always a black circle, then maybe set B has always some other kind of shape. In this case, it's always a white triangle. By doing that, we spotted a pattern in each set A and set B, and we can move on to answering the test shapes. We can see that number 1 belongs in set A, it has that black circle. Number 2 belongs in neither, it has a white circle and no white triangles, so it doesn't fit either set. Number 3 belongs to set A, it has a black circle. Now this one could go either way, it's not really important for the purposes of this warm-up, but it's important to know actually in set A you have a black circle as well as a white shape. So maybe number 3 you could argue goes in neither because it has got a black circle but also a black triangle in that. So that one could go either way, but this is just a warm-up to get you a flavour for the questions. Number 4 belongs to set B, it has that white triangle. And number 5 belongs in neither. Now this is an important example because obviously number 5 could go in both set A and set B, but by that very nature it belongs in neither because these sets have to be mutually exclusive. Let's look at this third example. Pause the video now and have a go for yourself. Okay, now we're getting on a roll with these questions, and I would like to introduce the tip here: try and sit back from the question. It's not always necessary for these sort of easy, more simple questions, but if you sit back and sort of let your eyes gloss over the patterns, sometimes you can see things that link the whole set together. In this case, you can see that set A always has quadrilaterals, whereas set B always has triangles. That's the pattern. So if we go through the test examples one by one again, number 1 belongs in set A, it has that quadrilateral. Number 2 belongs in neither because it has both triangles and quadrilaterals, therefore it cannot belong to either set because they are mutually exclusive. Set 3 only has triangles, therefore it belongs to set B. Number 4 has a sort of mixture of shapes, quadrilaterals and circles, therefore it belongs to neither. If you go back to set A just to check that rule, you can see that all of them have quadrilaterals but no other shapes. Whereas this number 4 has circles in there as well, so we can exclude that one and put it in neither. Finally, the 5th item that we're given, that clearly belongs in set A. It's all quadrilaterals, and that's what defines pattern A. Moving on to example number 4 then. Pause the video now and have a go at this one. Okay, going through it together. So this is a real example, and you're getting a flavour for the kind of questions that come up in AR now. And it's important to remember that given our previous 3 examples, you can see that the pattern is different. It operates on different modalities, if you like, each time. It's therefore important to keep an open mind and not get hung up on previous questions and what their patterns were. Keep a fresh slate in your mind for this new pattern. You can see here that in set A, we only have 1 shape in each example, whereas in set B, we have 4 shapes in each example. Now at this point you could look for secondary rules, other kind of things that might be going on, but because this is a simple warm-up question, that's likely to be the pattern. So if we go through it again one by one, we can see that number 1 belongs in neither, it only has 2 shapes. Number 2 has 4 shapes, so therefore it belongs in set B. Number 3, again 4 shapes, it belongs in set B. Number 4 has that 1 shape, that big 1 shape, that's set A. And finally, number 5, that belongs in set A as well, because it only has 1 shape in that example. So let's go through why they test AR, because a lot of students find it frustrating that it doesn't even seem to link to anything in real life, that it's too abstract, if you like. Well, the first thing to say is that AR is all about spotting patterns, and that's actually what you do a lot of your life if you're a doctor, whether that's in X-rays or clinical signs and symptoms. It's also about forming links, bringing together your knowledge about different shapes, different sides of shapes, and linking that to set B and finding that complementary pattern. That's a regular skill which is used in medicine to find links between a patient's history and story and the clinical syndrome that they might be experiencing now. Third, AR is all about avoiding distractions. Now we haven't quite come across these sort of examples yet because we've just been operating off basic patterns, but often there are distractions in these abstract reasoning questions. And by testing that, AR helps to sort out those candidates which can efficiently put aside the distractions and focus on the information which counts. Also, as I've said before, it's an immense time pressure. You've got 13 minutes to answer 55 questions. albeit grouped in sets of 5, but it's still very much a time-pressured environment. By testing that skill, universities can essentially assess whether you'd be good at medicine in a time-pressured and stressful environment. So why do UCAT students always dread their abstract reasoning section? Well, the first reason is that it requires a lot of practice. It's not really a skill that you can intuitively get almost. It requires question after question for you to be exposed to these kind of patterns to know what you're looking for. The second reason is, like I said before, it's very time pressured. You've only got 13 minutes to do it. I don't know whether you've ever sat down and timed that amount of time or played a game on your phone, but that's a very short amount of time and it's over before you know it. Third, AR is a new skill. It's not always tested at schools, unlike, for example, the quantitative reasoning section, which relies on your GCSE mathematics skills. And finally, there isn't always an obvious way to improve, and that can lead to people feeling like they're stagnating or they're not really making any progress with AR. Just remember that you need to sit there and expose yourself to many patterns as possible. By doing that, you are improving, even though it might not feel like it because each pattern is new. If you went back over those patterns, you might be quicker to spot what you missed before. And finally, going on to our final part of the session today, the things to do, the good things that can help you with the AR section. First, begin by spotting the patterns in set A and set B. There's no point in starting on the test shapes because they really offer you no information. Start with set A and start with set B. If you're finding it difficult to find a pattern in set A, for example, maybe move on to set B. Find the pattern in set B and then find the complementary pattern in set A. Remember that these are all examples of a pattern which you can use to your advantage. You can also look for similarities between A and B. Often this might tell you or offer you a hint about what's important to do with the pattern. Sometimes a similar theme can be applied across A and B, which might highlight what things to look at. Remember to spend only 1 minute per question set. If you find yourself after 1 minute still struggling to see that pattern, it's likely that you're not going to be able to see it, at least for a very long time. So it's best to move on and maybe you'll get a more simple pattern in the next question, which you can race through more easily. And finally, we haven't really come on to this yet because we haven't approached type 2 and type 3 questions, but remember to spend less time on them when we do cover them. Now moving on to the do nots and other things to avoid. Well, first, avoid starting with the test shapes. It sounds simple, but it can be very tempting to look at the test shape and think, oh, does that look more like set A or set B? Remember that the test shape can belong to neither set and therefore offers you no extra information about the patterns at play. Similarly to before, don't spend too long on a question. Remember that you've only got a certain amount of time for this whole section and that each mark is worth the same. It's worth maximising your marks on the simple questions rather than struggling with the harder, more complicated patterns, which in effect only maybe 5% of candidates may get anyway. Remember, if you're struggling, move on to the next pattern. Third, don't try and answer the test shape by looking at what looks similar in A and B. If you haven't spotted the pattern, this is a dangerous way to go. That being said, if you're short on time and you know that you haven't got enough time to fully assess the pattern, it might be worth simply guessing on what that test shape looks like. But that's only when you're feeling very time pressured towards the end of the test. And here are your take-home points. First, we looked at how to approach the abstract reasoning section. Second, we looked at the things to do, the positive things that can help improve your performance in abstract reasoning. And finally, we looked at the things to avoid, remembering to focus on the patterns first and then the test shapes afterwards, unless you're very short of time.